So welcome to Brookings. If everyone could turn off their cell phones or put them on mute, that would be very helpful. We're going to talk about economic growth. While the U.S. economy has not yet completed the path to full employment, we're getting close. And looking ahead, economic growth will depend on productivity and labor force growth, and both have slowed in recent years. Looking more widely, growth in the global economy will also depend on those two drivers, and in emerging markets, population and labor force growth is expected to slow pretty dramatically in most of them. We're fortunate today to have a wonderful set of speakers to talk about these issues, and to start us off, we're very privileged to welcome Jason Furman, a longtime friend and friend of Brookings. Jason is currently the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, best job in the world. He was deputy director of the National Economic Council. He's been a senior fellow at Brookings and at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. He's written many articles and books. His PhD is from Harvard. Jason, welcome. Thank you.
So thank you, Martin. It's great to be back at my old home of Brookings and to be talking on the most important topic in economics, which is economic growth. And the reason it's such an important topic is that the goal of economic policy is to raise the incomes of middle-class households and those working to get into the middle class, and a necessary but certainly not sufficient condition for sustained increases in incomes is stronger economic growth. Growth has been stronger lately. Over the last 2 years, it's been 2.8% annual rate, as opposed to a 2.1% annual rate in the first 3.5 years of the economic recovery. But we're still not all the way recovered, as Martin said. And even when we are, we'll face the decades-long challenge of slower middle-class income growth, with middle-class incomes over the last couple decades growing at about 0.5% per year, much slower than the 3% per year in the decades before that. And Council of Economic Advisors has done analysis that shows that the biggest source of this slowdown in the last several decades in middle-class incomes has been productivity growth. Hasn't kept up with what it used to be, although inequality and more recently labor force participation have also played a very important role. In my comments today, I'm going to focus on one policy instrument that relates to growth, one that I think is quite important, and that is expanded trade increases in U.S. exports. In terms of policies, this refers to regional agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, two trade agreements that we're in the process of negotiating that would put the United States at the center of nearly 2/3 of the global economy. It also includes multilateral agreements at the WTO, like the Information Technology Agreement, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, Trade and Services Agreement, and Environmental Goods Agreement. I'm going to argue first that all of these trade agreements benefit the middle class, and they do that through the mechanisms of increasing job quality and expanding choice. That first part is what I view as the conventional argument for trade, but then what I'm going to really focus on and what really links into today's session is the underappreciated and potentially more important impact of trade, which is actually to expand economic growth itself. I'll then briefly touch on how trade increases the returns to complementary policies, and then finally try to relate some of the discussions around trade to some of the recent macroeconomic debates over secular stagnation and global imbalances. So first I'll start with the traditional case for trade, and the traditional case goes back nearly 200 years to David Ricardo and centers around comparative advantage, the idea that you should specialize in doing what you do better. In the last 200 years, we've added a lot of things to the list, but they all have a similar character. We've added increased returns to scale from the larger scale of markets, that a lot of what trade does doesn't just increase the quantity of what's imported or exported, but operates on the extensive margin as well, bringing new goods that would not have otherwise been imported, new businesses that wouldn't otherwise have exported. And we also better appreciate the importance of foreign direct investment. When you take all of these together, you can summarize the benefits they have for the middle class in those two factors, increasing the quality of jobs and increasing the purchasing power of consumers. In terms of job quality, the wide range of research has found that jobs in export-intensive sectors pay 18% more than jobs in less export-intensive sectors. CEA has done research that controls for worker and industry characteristics and finds that you still have a $1,300 additional earnings that you get from working in an export-intensive industry. That's the equivalent of 2 months of the typical household's food budget. You also, for those not engaged in exports, still have the benefit of the higher real wages associated with the lower costs of the goods that you import, as well as the consumer benefits that you get from a greater variety of goods. To quantify these types of effects in the context of TPP, an agreement that includes 11 other countries and nearly 40% of the global economy, it's important to start by understanding what it is that TPP does. First of all, the United States itself is already very open. Our tariffs average 1.4%, and 70% of the goods come into our country entirely tariff-free. Our partners in TPP tend to have higher tariffs. In some cases, like autos in Malaysia, they're as high as 30%, or agricultural goods in Vietnam, they're as high as 40%. So TPP is disproportionately about removing barriers to American exports. TPP also removes a lot of the non-tariff barriers, which are even more disproportionate in our TPP partners to what we have here in the United States. TPP would have the highest and most enforceable labor and environmental standards of any agreement. It would be the first trade agreement to include disciplines on state-owned enterprises and to ensure a free and open internet. Peter Petrie, Michael Plummer, and Fan Zai have the best model so far to quantify the types of effects I've been talking about, these types of comparative statics associated with specialization. It's an 18-sector, 24-region computable general equilibrium model that takes into account tariffs, non-tariff barriers, foreign direct investment, and a variety of other factors. And they find that in 2025, TPP will expand the economy by 0.4%, worth $77 billion annually in 2007 dollars. The European Union's analysis of TTIP has found a similar magnitude of benefits for the U.S. economy. Now, some have described these totals as small, but I think I would risk losing my license to offer economic advice if I counseled anyone to leave $77 billion lying on the sidewalk each year. This all, though, is based on the conventional, traditional case for trade as amended, as I said, over the last 200 years. But all of what I've been describing is essentially an analysis in comparative statics. You change something, you move to a new level. It's a better level, but you're then staying at that level. What I want to spend more time on is the new case for trade, which is rooted in the role that competition, market size, specialization can all play in increasing innovation and thus increasing economic growth. Petrie, Plummer, and Zai are the first to point out that their estimates could greatly understate the gains from TPP and trade agreements more broadly because they don't incorporate these types of factors that would reflect on growth. And as Bob Solow, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, said, quote, "Relatively free trade has the advantage that the possibility of increasing market share in world markets is a constant incentive for innovative activity." I want to draw on Solow's contributions to economic research in fleshing that out. And one of his contributions was pointing out that output is determined by capital, labor, and the way in which you combine the two of them, a concept that economists call total factor productivity. Total factor productivity, we understand better, itself is a function of a production function that produces innovation. And I'm going to talk about how trade is both a direct input into that production function, so you get more innovation out of trade, but also how it increases the incentives that businesses have to innovate. The first way in which it does this is trade leads to greater specialization. And the same law of comparative advantage that applies to imports of wine and clothing also applies to the production of innovation itself. So if Toshiba specializes more in improving memory chips, and Intel specializes more in improving microprocessors, that will itself strengthen the ability of both of them to not just produce what they can produce today, but to develop new ideas about how to produce new things and produce more cheaply in the future. Strengthening intellectual property can help facilitate this by enabling more licensing, which itself allows more specialization. A second way in which trade can increase innovation is that it helps firms become more productive by accelerating the global flow of ideas. For example, US manufacturers have learned about lean production from Japanese manufacturers, and there's an increased set of economic evidence associated with learning by exporting. One of the ways in which this happens is that half of what the United States imports are actually not final consumer goods, but inputs into the production process of final goods itself, and we learn from importing those and from the ideas that are embodied in them. Trade also increases the incentive to innovate. This is something that Solow highlighted in the quote that I read to you before. One way in which it does this is it expands the size of the market, and innovation has a certain fixed cost associated with it, and so a larger market size won't just help you take advantage of the technologies you have today, but increases the incentive to have new ones. For example, the app stores that Apple and Google have a large global reach, which contributes to the large number of software developers that participate in them. Studies have also found that the larger size of markets can lead to more R&D. Trade also increases the incentive to innovate, even holding the size of the market constant. And this is based on an idea that Ken Arrow talked about 50 years ago, that monopolists can often have weak incentives to innovate because they're not able to basically steal market share from their competitors because they don't have any. Trade increases competition, and competition can increase innovation. This is something you see in a lot of modern Schumpeterian models that model innovation as a function of the amount of competition you're under. Now, one important finding of those models, to nuance what I was just saying, is that too little competition can make you sort of a lazy, happy monopolist who doesn't innovate. Too much competition can take away some of the returns and benefits you'd get from new innovation if they were immediately spread to others. And so you need to strike the right balance to ensure that you have competition, that you're expanding it, but that you can also protect, for example, some of the benefits associated with intellectual property and innovation. Everything I've been describing is a number of different ways that trade increases innovation. Of course, the opposite is also true. Firms that are more innovative are going to be better able to access the global market. And ultimately, it isn't that trade causes innovation or innovation causes trade, but the two of those are jointly determined by the set of choices that businesses make, choices that are shaped by the incentives that we give to businesses. And some recent surveys of the literature have described this relationship between trade and innovation as, quote, a robust finding, unquote. So in summary, for this particular part, the second part of what I was talking about today, long-run growth is the key to living standards. Productivity is the key to long-run growth. And trade, in ways that have been underappreciated and often not included in the quantitative models we use, has played a role in fostering all of that. And if we can conclude TPP and these other agreements, we'll do even more so in the future. The third part of the discussion I wanted to have is talking about how globalization raises the benefits of policies that complement expanded markets. Part of the importance of this is rooted in the fact that globalization has all the types of benefits I've been talking about, but it's also undoubtedly played a role in increasing inequality, although one that most economists would say comes below factors like technology, education, and institutions. And it's also played a role in worker dislocation, although again, probably a small fraction of the dislocation in the economy. But these challenges associated with globalization are real, and they merit a serious policy response. Part of that policy response is in the way we negotiate trade agreements themselves. That many of the issues that people worry about with globalization is a function of the process, a process that is because containers allow you to ship more easily, because the internet allows you to research foreign markets, and isn't specifically and explicitly rooted in the agreements themselves. Part of the point of agreements like TPP is actually to better manage the process of globalization. So you're going to have basically almost the same degree of openness of the US market to imports with or without TPP, because our tariffs, as I said before, average 1.4%. The difference is that you're going to have higher labor and environmental standards, more restrictions on state-owned enterprises than you would have had in the absence of an agreement. Part of the second part of policies that complement is, no matter where we were on trade, the president would be pushing infrastructure, he'd be pushing research, he'd be pushing education, much of which requires us to be able to relieve the sequester, and he'd be pushing productivity-enhancing policies like business tax reform. But every one of these policies has even higher returns in a world where there is more expanded trade, more ability for businesses to export, because we can take advantage of the economies of scale that those larger markets have, underscoring that these policies are even more important than they otherwise would have been. In addition, the other set of policies that complement trade are ones that help protect workers from the downsides of any cause of dislocation and inequality, including trade, help them get back on their feet and succeed in the economy. Programs like the Affordable Care Act and unemployment insurance don't ask why you don't have health insurance or why you lost your job, and in the vast bulk of cases, that won't have anything to do with trade, but it will help you regardless of the causes. At the same time, the administration has both proposed programs to help dislocated workers regardless of the cause of dislocation, as well as to extend and strengthen TAA, which expires at the end of this fiscal year. A lot of these complementary policies are fiscal policies, and in that respect, it's notable that insofar as trade is increasing your growth rate, it'll help relieve some of your fiscal pressures and put you in a better position to pursue these types of policies. Having gone through a range of things related to trade, I wanted to comment a little bit on the really fascinating discussion and debate that's been going on with a wide range of people, the most notable contributions being Larry Summers, and then through his wonderfully named blog, the Ben Bernanke blog, a debate over really the causes of some of the slower growth we've seen, and in particular looking at it through the prism of why equilibrium interest rates have been so low, with Larry arguing that a lot of it is rooted in the lack of productive investment opportunities that leaves that interest rate low, and Bernanke arguing or placing more emphasis on global imbalances. Now, I'm not planning to tell you, who I side with in this debate. I recently answered a set of really demanding questions related to the macroeconomy, all of which were posed by me, and one of them was secular stagnation, so you can look there. But what I want to talk to is, if you believe either of these hypotheses, what does it mean for trade? So first, secular stagnation. As Larry has advanced the argument, secular stagnation says we don't have enough productive investment opportunities. In order to get enough, we would need to drive the interest rate to much more negative levels than we're capable of doing, given the constraints of the zero lower bound. And as a result, he warns that the economy will be chronically demand insufficient. Insofar as you accept that diagnosis of the problem, trade helps remedy it. It helps remedy it by creating new productive opportunities that would increase investment for any given interest rate, and in the process raising the growth rate and thus raising the equilibrium interest rate, giving more space for monetary policy to do whatever it needs and wants without bumping into the constraint of the zero lower bound. I don't want to overstate this argument. I wouldn't claim that there is secular stagnation. I wouldn't claim that if there is, that trade would fully solve it. This isn't to diminish other recommendations that Larry has made, like infrastructure, but it would help. And even if you don't think there's secular stagnation, having more room between equilibrium interest rates, having a higher equilibrium interest rate and thus more room for expansionary monetary policy would help stabilization in the future. The other side of this recent debate has focused on global imbalances, or the global savings glut, as Bernanke called it a decade ago. And it also relates to aggregate demand. This view posits that a combination of underlying structural economic features and deliberate policy choices have led to an uneven global allocation of investment and savings. The result for the United States, according to this view, is that we import capital and run an essentially commensurate trade deficit. Notably, such trade deficits appear to have been linked to other imbalances, like the debt-fueled housing bubble that precipitated the financial crisis. Overall, according to this view, large persistent current account deficits force a choice between contractionary pressures and market bubbles that can boost consumption in the short run, but threaten macroeconomic and financial stability down the road. These global imbalances can be understood as rooted in three factors. The first is macroeconomic policies broadly construed. The second is national exchange rate policies. And then the third is other asymmetries across countries, including the types of trade policies that I've been discussing today. The largest source of the current global imbalances stems from macroeconomic policies, broadly construed. And you see countries like Germany that have current account surpluses that have increased to 7.8% of GDP, that in 2014 exceeded the current account surplus from China, even though Germany's economy is smaller. This type of surplus is largely attributable to Germany's high exports outside the borders of the euro area and a number of fiscal or structural policies to increase domestic demand, such as public investment in infrastructure, increased tax incentives for private investment, or greater expansions in wages and consumer spending could address this imbalance. A second source of global imbalances can be currency policies that target an undervalued exchange rate in order to shift global demand. The United States has made progress towards promoting more transparent market-based exchange rates as a key element of our international economic policy, including commitments we've secured through the G7 and G20. China has historically had a systematically undervalued exchange rate that has contributed to global current account imbalances while helping to sustain imbalances within China's own economy. In response, the United States' intensive economic diplomacy with China, including through the strategic and economic dialogue, has made some progress in addressing these concerns. The yuan has seen a real effective appreciation of nearly 30% since China allowed its currency to resume appreciation in mid-2010, and the Chinese current account surplus has fallen from 10% of GDP in 2007 to 2.1% of GDP in 2014. The United States and the broader global economic community will continue to push China to fulfill its S&ED commitments to move towards a market-determined exchange rate. The third source of global imbalances is other economic asymmetries across countries that include the asymmetries in the level of government interventions that distort the free flow of trade. And for a given set of exchange rates, the fact that the U.S. economy is already very open, combined with the often larger barriers to our exports to the rest of the world, can be a source of imbalances. And in that respect, it's notable that using available data, the United States is currently running a small goods and services trade surplus with the totality of our 20 free trade agreement partners, and that TPP would disproportionately result in reducing barriers to U.S. exports and thus could only help deal with that aspect of global imbalances as well. Now, the bottom line is that whether one places weight on secular stagnation or global imbalances, trade liberalization offers important economic benefits that help address either concern. Secular stagnation would be ameliorated by the faster productivity growth I've been describing, and global imbalances require a range of approaches, including macroeconomic policy and currency, but also include opening up markets overseas. I want to conclude by bringing it back, though, to what I think is the main point and the point I most want to underscore from this discussion. I think the Bernanke-Summers focus on aggregate demand is extremely important. It's helping us to understand the recession and recovery that we've gone through. It'll help us think about the next recession, but it doesn't get at what I think is the most important economic question, which is what is the future of productivity growth, and what can we do to make a brighter future for productivity growth? There's a lot of parts to that, and what I've tried to argue today is that expanding trade is very much an important part of achieving that. This isn't the only benefit of trade. In the economic report of the president, most recent one, we documented the ways in which it reduces global poverty, raises working conditions abroad, can contribute to gender equality, can help the innovations that can deal with climate change. But ultimately, the most important aspect of trade is what it can do for economic growth and what it can do to complement the other policies like infrastructure, education, research that are also essential for the future productivity of the U.S. economy and the living standards of our people. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then I'm going to throw it open to the audience. Now, let me start by saying I'm a big fan of free trade and a supporter of free trade, but I think I wouldn't be doing my duty as a interlocutor here if I didn't press you a bit on some of the benefits and costs of free trade. So some folks, David Autor at MIT, but certainly not the only one, have really said that trade with China and the massive deficit we have with China has had a devastating effect on employment in manufacturing, which has declined by several million since 2000 and is only coming back very slowly, probably will never get back to the levels it was at before. He and others have pointed to the effect that that's had on certain communities where plants shut down and so on. So do you buy that? Do you think that's trade that's doing that? Or give us a response to some of those criticisms that we hear.
Yeah, I think that work by David Autor and his co-authors is really important and is really worth taking seriously. I've noted that they themselves have very strongly endorsed TPP and made a powerful case for it in a Washington Post op-ed a month ago. Their research is, first of all, it's important to understand what their research finds and what it doesn't find. They look at local area effects, and they look at areas that are more affected by imports and track what happens to manufacturing jobs and thus what happens in the economy. That's an important part of the story. Their research, and they'd be open about this, by research design can't track two other things. It doesn't track, as we import more, half of what we import, as I said, is an input into the production process. And so a lot of American manufacturing in the American economy benefits from that side of the equation, but it's not concentrated in a local area, so it's not something that they can well identify. So they don't get the totality of the effect even on the manufacturing sector, and they certainly don't purport to be measuring the overall costs and benefits. Nevertheless, I think it is something that the economics profession, takes more seriously than it took 15 years ago. I think it takes it more seriously because the composition of trade and who we're trading with is different than it was 15 years ago. The question then is, what does that mean that we should do? Well, one thing we could do is sit around and wait for China to conclude more free trade agreements of its own with other countries, and to do that without the types of labor and environmental standards that I've been talking about. I think that would harm the U.S. economy. It would lead to trade diversion. It would lead us out of it. Or another option is to instead take the lead and try to shape the global rules about trade. Make sure that, given the openness of the U.S. economy, we are, as I was talking about before, having the strongest labor and environmental standards that we've had in any agreement, addressing a range of other issues like state-owned enterprises, so that you're better, in effect, managing the types of policies that David Autor proposed. And the last thing is just the complementary set of policies that I was talking about are quite important. And we shouldn't just think of those as TAA. We should think of them also really as the types of things we can do to take advantage of the opportunities that trade offers, so the infrastructure, the research, the education everything I had been describing in my remarks.
One question is, I don't think China is part of the TPP negotiations, even though it's the largest economy and the largest trader in Asia. Is that a concern, or is that just part of, is that the right strategy?
This is a high standards, high values trade agreement, and we're trying to work with countries who are going to be able to have the types of transparency, the types of national treatment, non-tariff barriers, labor rules, environmental rules, a whole range of things that are up to the standards that we have to participate in the agreement. And that's something that we think the countries that we're working with right now are going to be able to achieve, and we're going to work with them to achieve.
Do you hope that China will eventually join the TPP and be part of that process?
We are focused on...
If you can't answer these questions, that's fine.
Yeah.
But
we're focused on this set of countries right now.
Yeah, okay. The secular stagnation issue, and I've been reading the blog of my new colleague Ben Bernanke and Larry's answers to that, and I think Ben is right, and I think other people, including I, have said to Larry, you've got to take into account the international connection here, and that there are investment opportunities overseas, and you can shift from a trade deficit to a trade surplus, which generates demand. But as we look around the global economy today and we see what's happening in Europe, the emerging markets are weaker, even China is growing more slowly. Is that a realistic scenario? It seems like the dollar is become increasingly overvalued, and the idea of a trade surplus seems to be even further away. I mean, when's the last time we had a trade surplus? Very briefly, perhaps in 1990, but that was actually, I think, a current account surplus. We haven't had trade surplus in a long, long time. So is that a realistic way out of secular stagnation for the United States?
This is a matter of the direction you're moving. So our current account deficit has been cut from about 6% to about 2%, and now it's the smallest it's been since the late 1990s. So I think we, in a lot of ways, have been successful at rebalancing our economy. Part that's because of domestic choices we've made, reducing the deficit, expanding our production of petroleum, reducing our consumption of petroleum. In part, that's because some of the movements that we've seen in the rest of the world and some of the rebalancing and progress elsewhere that I was talking about in my remarks. So I don't think the question is, can we have a trade surplus? Can we have a trade deficit? The question is, will these policies help or hurt? And the argument I was making is that they would help. There's no doubt that the biggest influence on our exports is growth in the rest of the world. There's almost a perfect correlation between the growth in our trade-weighted GDP of our trading partners and U.S. exports. So, something like the Korean FTA, exports have increased to Korea following the FTA, but the trade balance has worsened with Korea, and that's a function of what's happened to Korea's economy in the last couple of years. It doesn't tell you something about the FTA itself. So I think, for almost because of all the reasons you were saying, Martin, that's almost more of an argument for the importance of this. Not saying this will solve all our problems, but this will move us in the right direction.
Right, right. How do you make trade a little bit more popular? I will take the liberty of reminiscing as to when I was in your job as we were pushing to admit China to the WTO, and there was the famous meeting in Seattle where the Boeing workers went out marching against globalization, which was a little strange to me, given how many planes they sell overseas. But anyway, so I went out there. I was sort of the scout or whatever for Clinton coming out, and they canceled my speech because they said they couldn't guarantee my safety. And so I flew home with my tail.
This is making me nervous here at Brookings.
My tail between my legs. So clearly trade, it's not just an academic argument. How can we make trade and trade agreements more understood, more popular? How do we deal with this popular opposition to trade and trade agreements? That's a tough question, but...
I was going to answer, you come to Brookings, explain it all, and then everyone will know.
Way to go, yes. I like that answer.
So, and for the 300 million Americans that weren't able to make it here today, this will be on the CEA website, so you can read it there.
And on Brookings.
And on the Brookings website, more importantly. No, I mean, I think it's, I think it really is a matter of explaining, and it's also, I think it really is important to do what you hear the president doing repeatedly, and what I tried to do today, which is to distinguish between the process of globalization, which has brought huge opportunities, but it also has brought challenges, from the way in which we're managing that process of globalization and the choices we're making with regard to it. And with any issue, you have to ask yourself what the alternative is. And the alternative to TPP is we'd have 1.4% tariffs on average, dealing with a bunch of countries that weren't required to have labor standards, weren't required to have environmental standards, and could still maintain their non-tariff barriers. So a lot of it is, how are we managing globalization? What are the alternatives? And trying to really drive that home.
So I'm going to look for some questions from the audience. We do have mics. Please ask a question, don't make a speech, and please wait for the mic. All right, so we'll start here.
I also always like to encourage multi-part questions, because then I choose which part to answer and can ignore the others.
Okay, again, so long as they, well, why don't we start here? Yes, as long as there are not too many multi-parts, and identify yourself.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. I just want to give a context, which is the complexity of these issues are so enormous that just listening to it verbally is very hard to comprehend. So I'm a great believer in trying to tell your story for 11-year-olds and using graphics, if you want the American public to understand it. Okay. You used a very important word called process, which the only place I think is taught in the United States is when you study systems engineering. And I think one of the dilemmas we have is we don't understand how things work. So we don't know where to go and work. The other final thing I want to ask you about is this whole business of productivity. And this drive for productivity, which I understand at the very top level, but I remember when the decisions were made, I think it was back in the 80s, but maybe I'm wrong about that, about how we were going to become a service economy. And so as you improve a service economy, it seems we live in a world now where nobody has any time because they're in service jobs and they have to keep doing more and more in order to get better productivity. I mean, it's really shifted the economy. And my question is, what do you do about that?
There you go. I'm dying to hear the answer to that question.
I mean, that's a very big question, and that's actually one of the challenges we have in productivity, is that service sectors tended to have lower productivity growth than manufacturing. As we shift more towards that, where do we get that productivity growth? It's a big question, but I'll answer a part of it. And once again, whatever question you ask, the answer is going to be trade. And this one's no exception, because the United States has real comparative advantages in services. It's one of our really big strengths. It's also one...
A trade surplus.
And we have trade surplus in services. It's also one where we face much larger barriers to trade in services than we do in manufacturing, because the WTO, the GATT and the WTO concentrated on the manufacturing tariffs, not services, which often have barriers that aren't tariffs themselves. And so both the Trade and Services Agreement at the WTO, as well as TPP and TTIP, are disproportionately about services. And by expanding market scale, increasing competition, increasing innovation, all the things I was talking about, I think really would help productivity in that sector especially. I think to some degree, across the board.
Okay, so I denied you a question there, so if we could, gentleman on the left.
Thank you very much, Larry Checco. I'm wondering what income inequality has to do both with secular stagnation and global imbalance, and if that wouldn't help both of those theories out a little bit, if we could just level off. I mean, when you see that corporations are buying back their stock rather than increasing wages and benefits, obviously people can't afford to buy their goods. And wouldn't some policy revolving around income inequality help?
I think we care about income inequality because we care about how people are doing today, and because also income inequality is very closely correlated with mobility. So more inequality means less mobility, and makes a farce of the notion that we have equality of opportunity when income is distributed so differently. You don't have equality of opportunity, and we need take steps to rectify that. I don't see exactly how it's related to secular stagnation and global imbalances.
Well, if you give income to low people,
there's a little bit of the savings glut coming from yeah. So there's that relationship of you have a lot of savings and less consumption associated with high income. So I think it's probably part of it, but I don't think the reason you want to deal with inequality is to deal with global imbalances. I think the reason you want to deal with inequality is because you want to raise incomes here.
Question over there.
Morning. My name is Bill Harrington. I'm associated with a research entity called Wiki Rating, and I'm the structured finance expert for it. I've been a practitioner in the markets for derivative contracts for more than 20 years. And my concern is the quality of data that the government and that the private sector has to actually assess certain aspects of the economy. So I'm not going to give you a multi-part question, but I'm going to give you a multi-choice question. If the economics profession had developed a tool to adjust the national accounts to reflect the impact of derivative contracts, which are in excess of 500 trillion notional, on the U.S. economy, and this would be akin to, say, the adjustment to national accounts that medium income economies use to reflect the barter economy. This would be the other side. Would that adjustment be 0%, which is to say that the derivative contracts are fairly valued? Would it be plus 4% to say that not only are the derivative contracts fairly valued, but they have some sort of catalytic property that promotes growth? Or would it be minus 4%, which is to say the valuation problems are distorting valuations of companies and potentially the national accounts, and maybe serve as a proxy for more bailout risk?
So the United States has outstanding statistical agencies and outstanding statistics, but as good as they are, the economy keeps getting more complicated and harder to track, and the budgets keep getting tighter. And so I think there's a range of issues. Personally, I think some of those, we have the Office of Financial Research is putting together a lot more financial data and using that to help monitor some of the risks in the economy. I would separate that from GDP, though. If I have $1 and I hand it to you and you hand it back to me and we hand it back and forth trillions of times, that doesn't expand the size of our economy. The economy is only if you actually make something and sell it to me, or vice versa. So a lot of those financial transactions aren't in GDP and don't.
They're intermediate goods, essentially. Right. So they may facilitate other production or not, depending on your view of how they work, but they wouldn't be counted directly, yes. Yes, we have a question here.
Joe William from Brevin Howard. So this is probably not the biggest defense of TPP, and the story is probably not going to sing to most people, but I think it's pretty important. Could you discuss the way that TPP could be an agent of structural change in other countries, and then the benefits that would then come back to the United States? I'm thinking of Japan in particular, but there's probably other countries as well.
I think your question implicitly had the answer in it, which is a lot of what we're dealing with in other countries are, from our perspective and the perspective of our exporters, are non-tariff barriers. From the perspective of those countries, there are often a lot of structural rigidities that protect one entrenched interest within the economy at the expense of the broader economy. And by helping to negotiate those, in the case of Japan, for example, it's strengthening the third hour of Prime Minister Abe. I think it goes with the grain of the types of reforms that he himself wants to do and is working very hard on. And that together with, in the case of Japan, monetary and fiscal policy, the first two arrows are an important part of increasing its growth. And that matters not just for Japan, but also, as I said, because the primary determinant of U.S. exports is the level and growth of GDP in the rest of the world. So we want stronger economies in our trading partners in addition to more open economies in our trading.
Yes, question there, and then one there, and then we'll be close to done.
Thank you very much. Alex Spiriter with AICGS. You provided the broad picture and the priorities that that TPP, and I guess you would make the same case for TTIP. Yes,
absolutely.
Provide. I wanted to focus for a moment on 2015 as a year. This is a long process. This is something that will not be solved in the next few months. Where do you see the biggest risks to global trade, and therefore also for global growth, and particularly U.S. growth in 2015, given what we have seen in the past few months? If you had to sort of draw a map, where would you see those flashpoints? Thank you.
I mean, I think first of all, I'd start with the U.S. economy. Overall has a strong trend, has strong momentum. It bounces around from quarter to quarter. The data for the first quarter have been weaker, but most of the economic analysts have put a lot of weight on things like weather, the ports, and other factors like that. But if you look at, in particular, consumption and business investment, those are two of the more stable and inertial components of GDP, and combined, they've had very strong growth. The rest of the world, I think, is the biggest headwind that the U.S. economy is facing right now and is likely to face over the course of the next year. You've seen some positive data surprises over the last couple months, especially for Europe, but those are surprises. That's relative to what was expected, and expectations were quite low, and we're coming in a little bit above those low expectations. So that growth in the rest of the world is something I think is weighing on our exports and thus on our overall economy, and that's why it's important both to work with the rest of the world to strengthen it, and also important to make sure we're not doing things here like the sequester, for example, that would move our domestic economy in the wrong.
Do you think Russia is a threat to our economy through a sort of confidence effect, or is it just a political threat?
Right. I think Russia is primarily a geopolitical issue in terms of direct links. 0.1% of U.S. GDP is exports to Russia, so that's a trivial direct economic link. I think it does probably play to some degree into these broader confidence issues, and that's why I think successfully resolving our national security issues can help our economy as well. So I see those two as complementary.
Okay, question over here.
Thank you. Nick Farmer. You spoke a lot about the competitive advantage that the U.S. will get from TPP and the other trade agreements because of our open markets. Can you flip the argument on the other side and discuss some what our partners think they will get and their benefits vis-a-vis the trade agreements relative to the U.S.?
Yeah. In the Petrie, Plummer, and Za study I talked about quantifies that benefit for each of the countries, and they're meaningful in the case of every one of the TPP countries. Often a small economy can benefit more because trade is a larger fraction of what they're dealing with than it is for the United States. A lot of countries benefit, as we talked about in the context of Japan, for example, their non-tariff barriers aren't helping them, they're actually hurting them, and they're there because a concentrated interest is defending them at the expense of their country and at the expense of our country. So a lot of the basic lesson of comparative advantage itself isn't we win at your expense. It's we win together. We do what we're better at. You do better. You do what you're better at. So I gave the example of Intel and Samsung doing research on to some degree different areas and specializing. So I think all of those case for trade I was trying to make was very much a positive sum complementary case. I do think though, because the trade balance and these global imbalances are an important economic issue, and I tried to make that clear. From thinking about that, which is not the only lens to think about trade, but from thinking at that, that's where it's important that we're disproportionately reducing our barriers to export.
I think our time is up, and I want to thank you for a very substantive speech, for answering questions, which doesn't always happen. No, I mean that seriously. And thank you for coming here and giving us your time. So we appreciate it.
Thank you.